any chance, has anyone been to Rome before in this room? Oh, some people have been. I've never been. But if you've ever been to Rome, you'll know that there's a church there by the name of St. Peter in Chains. It's a basilica. And if you go to that basilica, you're going to find one of the greatest works of art that was ever built. It's called the Statue of Moses. And it was built by Michelangelo in 1515 during the Renaissance. Now, some of you may recognize this. We'll go and throw up the photo there. That's the statue I'm talking about. That's located in that church. For those of you who went to Rome, did you get to see this? Yeah, some of you? Okay, great. Now, for those of you who maybe seen this before or seen this for the first time, question for you. Does something seem off? Right? I heard a yes there. If you look real closely at Moses' head, you're going to notice he has hair, but then in the midst of the hair, he has some horns. That's odd, isn't it? There's two horns sticking up out of his head. And now before you think, oh, this is just something unique to Michelangelo, I'm not sure what he was doing. If you look at other Renaissance paintings and medieval paintings in the time of Moses, you'll start to notice the same thing. Go ahead and go to the next slide. Let's show a little more of this artwork, if we have it. Look at this. You have Moses, again, with horns. You have Moses again with horns, and yet again, Moses with a different pair of horns. Now you might be wondering, what is going on here? Why is it during the Renaissance era, these artists were painting horns on Moses and sculpting horns on Moses? And I get to nerd out, right? This is the fun part. It's because part of it has to do with Bible translation and the history of Bible translation. There is a passage in Exodus that we're going to throw up on the screen where it says this: when Aaron and all the Israelites saw Moses, his face was Karen, and they were afraid to come near him. Karen is the Hebrew word there that was used to describe Moses' face. Now, back in, I believe it's the 3rd century or the 4th century, I'm getting the dates wrong, but there was this guy by the name of Jerome, who was a theologian. He was a brilliant scholar, and he had the job of translating the Hebrew Bible into the Latin version we now know as the Vulgate. And when he got to this text, he realized, wait a minute, Moses' face was Karen. The problem is, Karen has two possible translations. One is glowing, and the second one is sprouting horns. And so Jerome had to decide, is it glowing, or does Moses have horns? And so Jerome went with the one he thought made the most sense, which was, well, maybe Moses had horns. That's why everyone was afraid of him. So in the Latin, he wrote Moses' face was horned. He had horns. And so over centuries after Jerome, the Vulgate, the Latin Bible, became the main Bible in the West. And so people started reading that, and so artists started thinking, Moses had horns. And that's why we get what we see in the artwork today. Now, you might be thinking, oh, that's an interesting fact, but it seems mostly harmless. So what if Moses had horns or didn't have horns? It's just a weird Google mistranslate issue, right? But the problem becomes that as you look at history, it wasn't just an issue of we got the art wrong or the depiction wrong, but there started to be some anti-Jewish sentiment that went around as well, that wait a minute, if Moses had horns, all Jews had horns. And perhaps they're also related to the devil. Now, you might be thinking, wait a minute, isn't this sermon about marriage? Like, what does this have to do with marriage? What does this have to do with divorce? Why are you talking about Moses having horns and art? Well, I think the reason why I started with the story was because I wanted to make a really clear point from the get-go, and it's this: how we read the Bible matters. Because how we interpret and apply God's word can significantly impact people for better or for worse. And you notice even in that story, something as small as was Moses' face glowing or did Moses have horns made a dramatic difference. And today, as we talk about marriage, we're talking about a particular subtopic, I think that has been interpreted and read and applied in such a way, especially in the last 50 years of the church, that has caused quite a bit of harm, quite a bit of consternation, quite a bit of hurt within God's family. And the topic I'm talking about is divorce. Now, before I jump into that topic and what the Bible has to say about divorce, I just want to read a quick statistic for you. In the United States, 41% of marriages end in a divorce. The CDC reported in 2023 that there were 672,502 divorces, which comes out to 77 divorces an hour. If that sounds really high to you, that's actually the second lowest number in the last 20 years, right? Now, here's what the reason why I'm mentioning these stats. It's because I want to recognize something about this room. What I want to recognize is it's highly possible that some people in here are divorced. It's highly possible that some people have been through or thinking about going through the process of divorce. And so I say that as a means of saying that I want to acknowledge that this is a very sensitive topic. And I want to approach it in a way that I hope by the end of this you'll say, this was a very compassionate, gracious way of navigating this topic. Because as you read what Jesus has to say, at first it's going to really sound like Jesus is really harsh about divorce. And Jesus is very no-nonsense about it, and there's not space for you to find yourself in his words. And so what I want to say is this, what we need to do when we hear Jesus' teachings is we got to be able to take in the context of what Jesus is saying. And we got to do the careful work of interpreting Jesus' teachings well. And if we do that this morning, there's 3 things I can promise you, and this is what they are. Number 1, you're going to discover that Jesus is far more gracious than you can imagine. Number 2, you're also going to realize that Jesus is offensive in ways you didn't expect. But then the last thing is, if you choose to see it, you'll find that both his grace and his offense comes from a place of wanting to love us well and care for us well. So with that as a preface, I'm going to go ahead and read what Jesus has to say in the Gospel of Matthew. And then for the rest of this morning, we're going to go ahead and interpret and break down this passage together. So go ahead and turn with me to Matthew. If you have a Bible, we'll be in the 19th chapter this morning, verses 1 through 8. When Jesus had finished saying these things, he left Galilee and went into the region of Judea to the other side of the Jordan. Large crowds followed him, and he healed them there. And some Pharisees came to him to test him. They asked, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason?" And Jesus replied, "Haven't you read that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female? And said, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate." "Well, why then," they asked, "did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away?" And Jesus replied, "Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. But it was not this way from the beginning. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another woman commits adultery." Now, if you've ever heard this passage read to you before, or if you've read it yourself, oftentimes if you kind of read it just on the surface level, what it sounds like is Jesus is saying that the only excuse for divorce, the only possibility for divorce is due to some form of sexual infidelity. And if that doesn't happen, then there is no legitimate reason for divorce. And over the past 50 years, and even recently, what we've seen is pastors actually teach their congregation that because Jesus said this, therefore, emotional abuse is not a reason for divorce. Therefore, physical violence is not a reason for divorce. Jesus said it, therefore we have to believe it, even though it's really, really hard and difficult and feels wrong. Now, question to you, does it feel wrong to say that, right? It does. And if you're feeling like that can't possibly be what Jesus is saying in that passage, then good. Hold on to that intuition. Hold on to that feeling, because what I want to show you is that Jesus isn't necessarily going there in that passage at all. And in fact, this is why context matters so much in the scriptures. And by the way, if you say, well, I just read the scriptures and I don't use context, that's not true. Jesus also says, hey, sell everything you have and give it to the poor and you will have treasures in heaven. How many of you have sold everything you have? Exactly. Why? Context, right? And so when we read Jesus' teaching on divorce, that also requires context. So first, let's look at this. The Pharisees come to Jesus, right? It's not Jesus who decides, oh, I'm on a mountain, I'm going to teach about divorce. No, the Pharisees come up to Jesus and they ask him a very particular question. They ask him this. Some Pharisees came to Jesus to test him and they asked, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? If you have a Bible or if you're taking notes, go ahead and circle, underline that phrase, for any and every reason. Because when the Pharisees are talking about for any and every reason, they are referencing a years-long debate about a specific passage in the Old Testament. And particularly, they are talking about this passage in Deuteronomy. And I'm going to go ahead and read it for you real quick because we don't have it up there. But if you turn to Deuteronomy and go to the 24th chapter, there's a passage there where Moses writes this. Suppose a man enters into marriage with a woman, but she does not please him because he finds something objectionable about her. That word right there, objectionable, is this phrase, avert devar, right? And in the Hebrew, that literally translates into the nakedness over a matter or the shamefulness of a matter or something that is offensive. Now, here's the question. What's the problem with that word, ervat devar, if it means objectionable or offensive? The problem is it's too ambiguous. What's offensive? What's objectionable? What is this shamefulness or nakedness of a matter? What does Moses mean about that? Because we need to be able to define what ervat devar means in order to figure out what Moses means when he says divorce is permitted. And so people argued about this, and two rabbis in particular went head to head over this. You had Rabbi Hillel and Rabbi Shammai, and they argued over this question. What did Moses mean in Deuteronomy 24:1 when he said that a man can divorce his wife if he has found ervat devar in her? So, first of all, Shammai decided, well, you know what? I'm going to take a stab at this. And he decided to translate it like this. He said this. Ervat devar, let's go to the next slide. Sorry about that. He said, a man should divorce his wife only because he has found grounds for it in unchastity, since it is said, because he has found in her indecency in a thing. In other words, what Shammai said was, well, what Moses is talking about, this objectionable thing, is obviously infidelity. That's how we need to define ervat devar. And so that was Shammai's opinion, and some people said, yay, Shammai, that sounds all right. But then Hillel came out and he said this. Even if she spoiled his dish, since it is said, because he has found in her indecency of a thing, a man may divorce his wife. In other words, Hillel said, if your wife can't cook, you can divorce her as well. Right? That's crazy. beauty. But what does that basically translate to? What that basically means is Hillel is saying any and every matter is ervert devar. Anything you can think of that is objectionable to you, you can divorce. So if you don't like her cooking, divorce. If you don't like the way she talks to you, divorce. If you don't like that she listens to Christmas music and it's not even Thanksgiving yet, divorce, right? That's what Hillel says. Now, think about this. If Shammai and Hillel are your two options, and everyone is invited to vote for which definition they like better, and based on what you know about human beings, which definition do you think won out? Exactly, ding, 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 you're right. Hillel's definition won out. The definition that won out was, we can divorce for any and every reason. And Moses said it, and we believe it, and we're going to go ahead and go about this. And so when they question Jesus, the Pharisees aren't interested in hearing what he has to say. It says they tested him, right? What they really want to know is not, Jesus, what do you think about divorce? They want to know, hey, Jesus, Hillel's got this figured out. He has the popular vote. This is how we've been defining avert devar for the longest time. So Jesus, you tell us, do you also agree with Hillel? Or do you dare oppose one of the greatest teachers of our times when it comes to divorce? And so Jesus brilliantly answers, well, no, I'm not Team Hillel. I'm not Team Hillel at all. And here's the reason why. It's not because I like Shammai better, but it's because I know of an authority that is greater than Shammai and greater than Moses. The authority I know of is the creating God. And if we look at who God is and what he has done, here's what's happened. And let's go ahead and throw up what Jesus says. Haven't you read, he replied, that at the beginning, the creator, the one who is greater than Shammai and greater than Hillel, greater than Moses, made them male and female, and said, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. Here's what Jesus is saying to the Pharisees. He's saying this, you have all missed the plot. You all have the wrong idea about this, because here's the thing. When God created marriage, he did this beautiful, miraculous thing of bringing two people and making them one. And it's a mystery we ought to celebrate and we ought to uphold and we ought to defend. And you're asking the question of, how can we kill this miracle? How close is the line? How close to the line can we get in order to do what we want to do? And Jesus is saying to them, no. The question to ask isn't under what circumstances can we kill the miracle? Rather, what can we do to preserve the beauty and the miracle of marriage? And so Jesus tells them, hey, flip it around. Stop talking about what are the excuses for divorce and start talking about what are the ways we can encourage the marriages in our lives and in the life of our community. And the Pharisees hate this, right? Because they were trying to get Jesus and they gave a way better answer than they expected. Because they didn't turn to Shammai, they didn't turn to Moses, they turned to God. And how do you fight God? So they decided, okay, well, here's the comeback, Jesus. So you say we ought to defend marriage and love marriage and respect God for creating marriage. But here's the deal. God spoke through Moses. And didn't Moses say we are commanded to divorce our wives for any and every reason? So Jesus, are you opposed to Moses? And so Jesus then again responds, no. I'm not against Moses. I'm not against the Old Testament, but you've got the Testament wrong. You've got the law wrong. You keep saying Moses commanded this of you, but just so we're clear, Moses permitted it. There's a huge difference between command and permit. And what you need to understand is, no, Moses permitted it because God permitted it. And the reason why God does this is, guess what, Pharisees? And guess what, people of God? We are stubborn. We are broken. we are sinful and we are capable of hurting each other in ways that sometimes make marriage unsustainable and no longer the good thing that God created for us. Divorce was never meant to be a casual choice in Jesus' imagination, but a catastrophic contingency. What Jesus is saying here is that, yes, Moses permitted it, but because there are times in the life of a marriage where things go off the track so badly that it is better to separate than to keep together for the health of both people. Now, notice what I said about catastrophic contingency. I want to give you an illustration of what Jesus might be talking about here. If you have a child, which I don't, but I'm just going to ask you all parents, and I read about this, and I think it's safe to say this. If you have a kid, and they come up to you and say, hey, I want to play with knives and cut off my hand to replicate Star Wars, what would you say to them? No, right? You would tell your child, absolutely not. You can play Star Wars in other ways, but you will not cut off your own hand, and you will not have your friend cut off your hand. And by the way, we're going to child-proof this kitchen and throw the knives up to the third cabinet, right? Because that's dangerous. Knives are dangerous, and cutting off your hand is not a good thing. And so you would tell your child, never, ever, ever let anyone take a sharp object and cut off your hand. However, if there's ever a moment that your child's hand were to become infected, if your child's hand get diseased to a point where it could no longer be saved, and in fact, the damage is so bad, it might impact the rest of the child's life, at that point, what would you say? Well, you would tell the doctor, go ahead and amputate the hand. Because by amputating the hand, all of a sudden the rest of the body can be preserved and the child can live the rest of their lives. Now, here's the key part. If the doctor is a good doctor, she is not going to look at a cut on a child's hand and say, oh, we're going to have to cut it off, right? If she's a good doctor, what she's going to say is, okay, well, let's try the least invasive method possible. Let's try a Band-Aid. If the Band-Aid doesn't work, let's try ice. If ice doesn't work, let's go ahead and try antibiotics. If antibiotics doesn't work, I don't know anything else after that. But the point is, she's going to go after list after list after list of the possible ways to treat the hand. And then at the last resort, if she cannot do anything but to cut off the hand, then she will amputate it. But the reason why the doctor will wait until the end is because she understands that once we have cut off the hand, there will be pain, there will be loss, there will be quite a bit of adjustment. And so that's why she's going to say, this is not a casual choice, but a catastrophic contingency. Jesus is saying the same thing here. Jesus is saying God has made two people, one flesh in marriage. And so there's nothing casual about amputating what God has brought together. If you are literally one body and you cut it off, then there's going to be pain. There's going to be hardship. There's going to be some acclimating that has to happen. There's going to be some recovery that has to happen as well. And so Jesus wants us to hear very clearly, God takes marriage very seriously. And the last thing that God wants for you is to divorce and to amputate what God has brought together. Now, I've said all that. And some of you may be wondering, well, that's a good teaching. But what about the whole thing about Jesus saying the only reason for divorce is sexual infidelity? What do we do about that? And so I do want to address that as well. And the first thing I want to say is, notice how I talked about Deuteronomy this entire time, right? Because the Pharisees bring up an interpretation of Deuteronomy, and so Jesus decides, okay, well, I will play on this playing field, and I'll talk about Deuteronomy as well. So Pharisees, if you're really interested in Deuteronomy, let me tell you what Moses means in that passage. What Moses means, what he means by the indecent thing, what he means by the objectionable thing, is, yes, if there is infidelity, there is possible reason for divorce. But here's the thing. Let's go ahead and throw up the slide real quick. Jesus is contesting that ervat devar doesn't mean any reason you can find but infidelity. We just said that, right? But in doing this, Jesus is making an interpretive rule on this specific passage about divorce. Jesus is not addressing every law on divorce in the Old Testament. He's talking about Deuteronomy, but he's not talking about other passages. And if you're wondering, well, Joe, are there other passages? I will tell you, yeah, there's actually one other significant passage when it comes to divorce. Now, Deuteronomy dealt with, when can a man divorce his wife? Right? It literally says that. But in Exodus, you'll find Moses talking about a scenario of when can a woman divorce her husband. And here's what Moses says. If he marries another woman, he must not deprive the first one of her food, clothing, and marital rights. If he does not provide her with these three things, she is to go free without any payment of money. Now, you might be thinking, wait a minute, this is about second wives and polygamy, and like, how does that relate to anything today? But I want you to pause for a second and think about the principle of what Moses is saying in that passage. What Moses is saying is, look, in a patriarchal world where men had quite a bit of power, he's saying to them and to married couples, look, if a man refuses to provide safety, if a man refuses to provide food, if a man refuses to provide clothing, if he refuses all the rights that are due to you as his spouse, then the marriage is dissolved. Or another way to put it is what Moses is saying is if there is any form of abuse, then the marriage can be dissolved. And here's the key thing about that passage. According to scholars, Hillel agreed with that interpretation. Shammai agreed with that interpretation. In fact, most Jewish scholars and rabbis of the time agreed that is what Moses meant. So follow me here real quickly. Number one, if nobody in Jesus' time debated Exodus 21, can a woman divorce due to neglect and abuse? No one debated that, right? Number one. Number two, if everybody in Jesus' time was debating Deuteronomy 24, which asked the question, can a man divorce for any reason? Right? You got that? And then if three, the question Jesus was being asked was about Deuteronomy and not Exodus, then what do we have to conclude? Well, number four, what we have to conclude is that Jesus' teaching that no divorce except infidelity is in response to primarily men and a few women who use Deuteronomy 24 to leave spouses for arbitrary and selfish reasons. And it's not in response to primarily women who used Exodus 21 to leave because of abandonment and abuse. Right? So here's the conclusions I draw from this. The thing I would say based on this reading of the text is that if in your lifetime you have ever heard the destructive teaching that Jesus is saying to stay in a dangerous situation because I command it and that is the way you live your witness into the world, I just want to tell you to go ahead and Control Alt and delete that idea from your head. Go ahead and delete that theology from your soul, because here's the thing. Jesus, in this moment, what he's trying to do is, when he's taking on Deuteronomy, he's trying to protect women, right? Because husbands in droves were saying, you can't cook, you can't clean, divorce, divorce, divorce. And Jesus steps into that and says, no, we're not going to treat marriage like that anymore. And you're not going to treat your wives like that anymore. So the point I'm trying to make is, if Jesus is going to these lengths in order to defend women here in this passage based on the Deuteronomy law, then why would Jesus all of a sudden also put women into a dangerous situation? Does that make any sense? No, Jesus wouldn't do that, right? Jesus would never do that. So here's a pastoral word to you, first of all, real quick, before we get into the next steps, and here's your takeaways for the morning. Let me just say this really clearly. Look, I am 99% sure this is the best way to interpret the Bible, right? But as Pastor Jeff says, we always have to say 99% because we're never sure, right? We could be wrong. But I'm willing to be wrong in saying this. If you are someone, whether if you are a husband or a wife, and you find yourself in a situation of abuse that is dangerous, you find yourself in a situation of violence that is dangerous, you find yourself in a situation where emotional harm is degrading you, then get out, get help, and have confidence that Jesus is for you and with you. And if you need to talk to someone, come find a pastor. Come find an elder. We want to walk with you through this. Do not listen to those teachings in the past you may have heard. Listen to what Jesus actually has to say to you today. So that's the first thing. Now, if you're not in that situation, right? If you're not in a situation of violence or abuse, there's three possible situations you can be in. Someone mentioned before service, there's plenty more. And I know there's plenty more, and we're not going to be able to address every single one of them, but I want to at least describe the three main places people may be in. And the first is this. Some of you, I know, are struggling in your marriages. And what I would say is, if there is no violence or abuse, so long as it depends on you, save the marriage. Do the work to save the marriage. Spend what you have to spend. Take the time that you need to take. Find the mentors you need to have. Go get counseling. Come find a pastor. Whatever you need to do, make sure that you do not resort to amputation when all you needed was an antibiotic. Do what you can in your power to preserve what God has made for you and gifted for you. And I promise you, that process will not be easy. But I don't think Jesus calls us to it because it's easy. He calls us to it because it is for our good. Stay in the fight of your marriages if you are struggling in your marriages. A second group of people I want to talk to this morning is you may be divorced, or you are in the process of divorcing, or it's possible you're thinking about divorcing, right? And here's what I want to say about that. How your marriage ended does not define you. My prayer for you is that Jesus' words would be healing for you. If you feel like you're here today and you divorced for all the right reasons, but there's pain and there's hurt, my prayer for you is that Jesus would be able to help you heal over time. And if you feel like, as I'm hearing the words of Jesus, I'm realizing maybe I didn't get divorced for the right reasons. And to you, I would say, hey, guess what? When your vows end, Jesus' love and grace for you does not. Your mistake does not get the final word upon your life. Jesus gets the final word upon your life. In summary, divorce does not define you. The love of God defines you. And last but not least, here's the last people I want to talk to. If you're in a strong marriage, or if you're in your season of singleness and you're finding strength in that, here's my message. Don't hoard your strength. Share your strength. Share it with the people around you. Share it with the people in your church. And in fact, I'll say this. You have your connection cards, right? If you feel like, man, we're celebrating 30 years of marriage and things are going so well and God has been faithful and we're seeing fruit everywhere and we have grandchildren and everything is going great, then here's one of the best things you can do on behalf of your church. You can let us know that you're doing great so that when there is a younger couple that may be struggling, we can say, hey, we have a couple for you that can nourish you, that can encourage you, that can support you, that can pray for you, that can give you wisdom and advice. So if you are in a place where God has blessed your marriage and things are flourishing, then please let us know. Share your strength. And if you are single, the exact same thing as well. Whether you are single because you were never married, or you're single because you're widowed, or you're single because you're divorced, guess what? In a church of our size, there are going to be people just like you. And they might not have the experiences you have. They might not have the wisdom you have. They might not have gone through the things that you have gone through. And they could use someone like you to show them who is Jesus in this moment for me. And if you feel like, hey, I'm one of those people, I can share my strength in my season of singleness, then please let us know as well. We're going to go ahead and transition into a time of communion. So would you join me in prayer as we do that together? Jesus, first of all, we want to thank you for the gift of marriage and the ways that you've created it for our good and to do something miraculous through it. And the miraculous thing, as we've been talking about for over the last 2 weeks, is that you've made it so that your glory might be known in the world through our love for one another. And today we've talked about a difficult topic, the topic of divorce, which touches almost every single one of us in one way or another. And God, I ask that in a topic so wrapped up in shame and in pain and in fear and consternation and complexity, God, would you break through in such a way as to provide healing for those in pain? Would you be a reminder to people in shame that your grace is sufficient? God, would you help us to be a people who navigate the end of marriages well in such a way that bring you glory? God, particularly this morning, I want to be praying for struggling couples. God, I ask that you would help them in the disagreements. You would help them in the inability or sometimes the lack of to be able to see the good that each other is doing. God, would you help them in such ways? Would you provide them a community in such ways that they might be able to have strong marriages that bring glory to you? And God, I also want to be praying for those who have gone through divorce or divorcing or even they are suffering the consequences of what happens when families are torn apart. God, I ask for your healing touch upon their lives. I ask that you would remind them that when vows end, your love for them does not end, that you are the one that defines them, you are the one that names them, you are the one that is sufficient for them. So God, be with us as we continue to live out our lives, whether as married couples or as singles, and may we do so so that your light may be shown into this world. We pray this all in your name, and all God's people said, amen.